It happened just after 22:14 Moscow time, on a cold November night when temperatures dipped to -11 degrees Celsius and the sky above the capital glowed with the faint reflections of anti-drone searchlights. At first, the outage seemed like a glitch. A few blinking routers, a sudden drop in mobile data, a wave of confused messages across Russia's remaining social platforms. But within 7 minutes, the blackout spread across 5 major cities, cutting off more than 32 million users from the outside world. What followed was unlike anything Russia had seen since the chaotic collapse of the 1990s. Taxi apps failed, online banking froze, food delivery systems crashed, even government workers reported their internal portals flickering offline, and within hours videos began to surface, shot on old offline cameras, showing crowds gathering near subway stations, shouting the one question the Kremlin feared most: what is Putin hiding? But the truth was already spreading faster than the blackout itself. According to multiple Western intelligence assessments reported by Reuters, the shutdown had nothing to do with Ukrainian drones. Instead, it was tied directly to a controversial new financial decree rushed through the Russian parliament. A decree that would raise income taxes, expand VAT enforcement, and push working-class families closer to the economic breaking point. By midnight, protests had erupted from Vladivostok to Novosibirsk, as thousands poured into the streets demanding answers. Their fury wasn't just about internet access. It was about the unraveling of a social contract that had held Russia together for 2 decades. Higher taxes, shrinking salaries, corruption exploding in broad daylight, and a government that now seemed terrified of its own people. As armored police units advanced toward the crowds, something unprecedented happened. They hesitated. Some officers lowered their shields. Others simply stood still, unsure whether to enforce the very blackout that had cut off their families as well. And then, just as tensions reached their peak, the unthinkable happened. To understand why this blackout triggered such a volatile reaction, the story must be placed inside Russia's broader political and military landscape. A landscape reshaped by 3 years of war, a shrinking economy, and a growing sense of national exhaustion. Since 2022, the Kremlin has relied on a carefully engineered information ecosystem, a system where state media reassures, foreign outlets are banned, and communication platforms operate only with government approval. According to reports widely covered by DW and BBC, more than 15,000 websites and social platforms have been blocked since the start of the conflict, creating the most restrictive digital environment in Europe. Yet, despite the censorship, Russians still found ways to connect, through VPNs, Telegram channels, and foreign hosted apps. But by late 2025, the situation changed dramatically. Moscow's finances were tightening. Western sanctions had slashed energy revenues, and the ruble had lost more than 40% of its purchasing power in 18 months. Defense spending soared, consuming an estimated 1/3 of the federal budget, while regional governments struggled to fund basic services. Inside this pressure cooker, the Kremlin introduced its most controversial fiscal plan yet, a sweeping tax overhaul that would effectively increase the burden on low and middle-income workers while reducing social benefits. Russian commentators on independent channels called it the biggest tax grab of the decade, citing calculations that the average worker could now see up to 70% of their income swallowed by payroll deductions, VAT charges, property taxes, transport taxes, and new regional fees. This was the spark. The first protests emerged in Vladivostok, a port city known for its independence streak. Demonstrators rallied against rising taxes and corruption. But something unprecedented happened. Their slogans drifted from local grievances to direct criticism of the Kremlin itself. Russian police quickly intervened. The next time protesters requested permission for another rally, authorities denied it, citing Christmas preparations, even though Russian Christmas is on January 7th, nearly 2 months away. That excuse became a symbol across social media. A joke in tone, but a warning in substance. If protests could be banned on such flimsy grounds, what would the Kremlin do next? Then came the internet cuts. Official statements framed them as tactical defensive measures, allegedly necessary to disrupt Ukrainian drone navigation. But according to analysts quoted by Reuters and Defense News, Ukrainian drones operate primarily in western and southern Russia, not in the Siberian regions where the blackout hit hardest. And crucially, only foreign-linked apps were blocked. State-run platforms stayed online. Government-backed news websites remained fully functional. Kremlin-approved messaging services continued to operate normally. This selective blackout revealed the deeper truth. The disruption wasn't about drones, it was about control. Putin's government had learned a painful lesson from 2 decades of protest movements in Russia, Belarus, and the Middle East. Revolution spread through networks, not crowds. And if networks could be severed at will, dissent could be strangled before it reached Moscow. But Russia in 2025 is not the Russia of 2012. Inflation is higher, wages are lower, entire industries depend on online infrastructure, and the war has reshaped society in ways no one inside the Kremlin fully understands. Millions of families now rely on military payouts to survive. Thousands of influencers teach young women how to marry soldiers before deployment to secure compensation. Criminal groups orchestrate fake marriages and steal soldiers' salaries. Regions introduce Hour of Victory programs, forcing workers to labor unpaid to support the army. And mothers, the last remaining moral authority in many communities, speak openly about abuse, torture, and impunity among enlisted units. This is the context behind the blackout: an economy strained to its limits, a population pushed into financial desperation, a government fearful of unrest, and a growing belief that the war, once distant, has finally returned home. Inside this environment, shutting down the internet wasn't just a technical decision. It was a political gamble, one that would ignite a chain reaction far beyond what the Kremlin anticipated. The chain reaction began almost instantly. When the first wave of internet outages hit Moscow and St. Petersburg, most residents assumed it was routine maintenance or a localized network issue. But when the blackout extended into Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, and Vladivostok within the next 30 minutes, panic spread through the country's digital arteries. Payment apps stopped working, online pharmacies froze, even government employees couldn't log into their internal portals. Russia, a nation that had spent years building a heavily monitored but still functional online ecosystem, suddenly found itself drifting backward into a pre-digital world. The Kremlin insisted this was a temporary counter-drone protocol. Yet within hours, videos emerged showing something Moscow never wanted the world to see: ordinary Russians openly mocking the explanation. Crowds chanted, "No drones in Siberia!" and "If this is security, why is Instagram the only target?" The irony stung. The same government that spent years boasting about cyber sovereignty was now pulling the plug on its own infrastructure. But the true escalation began the next morning. Across Telegram, one of the few apps still functioning intermittently, leaked documents began circulating. They showed regional authorities receiving instructions to limit unauthorized crowd formation and reduce access to destabilizing sources of information. The timing was suspicious. These orders were drafted 3 days before the internet blackout, meaning this wasn't a reaction to drones. It was a coordinated effort to smother the growing unrest over taxes. As the documents spread, so did the protests. Mini Climax 1, Vladivostok erupts. It started at noon on the city's waterfront. More than 1,000 people gathered, demanding the reversal of the new tax bill and the resignation of local officials who had banned protests under the excuse of Christmas preparations. Footage sent anonymously to BBC producers showed riot police forming tight lines but refusing to engage. Several officers kept their shields lowered. A commander shouted orders, but the crowd drowned him out with chants of, "Let us speak." This hesitation shocked analysts. In Russia's Far East, police units are typically uncompromising, but months of rising food prices, shrinking salaries, and endless military funerals had taken their toll. Many officers had family members affected by the very policies they were ordered to suppress. Mini Climax 2, The Hour of Victory Backlash. As protests spread, another bombshell hit the public domain. Local investigative journalists revealed that several defense companies have begun enforcing the controversial Hour of Victory program, forcing workers to contribute 1 unpaid hour per day to fund military equipment. The average contribution was only 500 rubles, about $6, but symbolically it became a lightning rod. Workers accused the government of turning them into economic conscripts. Videos emerged showing employees arguing with supervisors who insisted the rule came from the top. In one factory outside Khabarovsk, a manager tried to enforce the program and was shouted down by an entire production line. The video went viral before the blackout wiped it offline. Mini Climax 3, the scandal of the War Widows Market. Then came the twist that broke the government's narrative completely. A popular TikTok clip resurfaced, filmed by a young woman proudly showing the new apartment she received after her brother was lost in the conflict. Her tone was celebratory, almost gleeful, sparking outrage across social media. But that clip was only the surface. Independent media began reporting a disturbing trend: criminal groups arranging fake marriages between young women and soldiers about to be deployed. The motive was simple: compensation. In some regions, payouts for fallen servicemen reached the equivalent of $200,000, nearly 20 years of income for the average Russian household. One case quickly dominated headlines: a 40-year-old soldier who secretly married a woman the day before deployment. She never visited his family. She lived with her ex-husband. Yet when news arrived that he had fallen in combat, she appeared with full legal documents demanding the compensation. The soldier's sister also claimed the payout. Their dispute triggered a national scandal that exposed the entire underground network of fraudulent marriages, payment theft, and exploitation. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Kremlin. The breaking point: mothers speak out. Then the most emotionally powerful moment unfolded. A mother from Lermontov released a video describing how her 22-year-old son had been abused by two men returning from active service. Her testimony was graphic, heartbreaking, and politically explosive. These men were treated as heroes, shielded by regional officials, and allowed to walk free after signing another contract. When the mother addressed the investigative committee directly, her video reached millions before the blackout cut the connection. Her final words echoed across Russia: they return as heroes, but they are unpunished. For many Russians, this was the final spark. Unexpected twist: police defections. Across several regions, small groups of police officers were reportedly refusing to detain protesters. Some removed their helmets, others walked away from assigned routes. Video showed officers speaking quietly with demonstrators instead of confronting them. While these incidents involved only a fraction of the force, they symbolized a new phase. Even parts of the state apparatus were beginning to waver. Unexpected twist: Kremlin media slips. At the height of the chaos, a state-run news host stumbled during a broadcast, accidentally referring to the unrest as the largest civic mobilization since 1998, before quickly correcting himself. Clips of the mistake spread like wildfire. Analysts on Western channels noted the slip reflected genuine fear inside state institutions. Unexpected twist: leaked audio from senior officials. Hours later, a leaked audio file began circulating, reportedly a regional governor complaining to Moscow that the situation is spiraling and demanding a coherent response strategy. He warned that shutting down the internet only drives people into the streets and urged the central government to reconsider. Whether the audio was authentic remains unverified, but the damage was done. The public now believed the blackout was political. The government was panicking and society was reaching its boiling point. By the end of the second day, protests had spread to more than 9 regions. Thousands had taken to the streets, and Russia found itself facing a moment not seen in a generation. A nationwide challenge emerging not from elites, but from economically cornered citizens who felt betrayed by their own government. The protests were explosive, the blackout unprecedented, but the strategic impact inside Russia was even more destabilizing. For a government already strained by war expenditures, declining revenues, and shifting global alliances, the unrest triggered by the internet shutdown struck at the very foundation of Kremlin control, the assumption that the state could always outlast public anger. Yet by late 2025, that assumption was weakening. Economic shockwaves. According to multiple financial briefings referenced by Reuters, Russia's GDP growth had already slowed to near zero by the third quarter of the year. Sanctions tightened, energy exports to Europe shrank, a growing dependence on discounted oil shipments to Asia cut profits by over 30%, while the ruble hovered at historically weak levels. But the blackout introduced a new variable: economic paralysis. Electronic transactions, which account for more than 70% of consumer payments in major Russian cities, stalled for hours. Small businesses reliant on digital platforms saw immediate revenue loss. Delivery companies reported disruptions affecting tens of thousands of orders. Banks issued emergency statements urging customers to avoid panic. The Kremlin insisted the disruption was temporary, but markets reacted sharply. Regional business associations, normally cautious and politically neutral, warned that continued digital outages could lead to substantial liquidity problems across entire sectors. Even pro-government economists admitted the blackout shaved an estimated 0.2% off quarterly economic activity. In a fragile economy, that number mattered. Tax revolt as a national crisis. The new tax package, passed quietly but felt loudly, deepened the tension. Income brackets were revised, VAT enforcement intensified, and regional surcharges expanded. Analysts from DW and The Guardian estimated the average household would pay 25 to 40% more in direct and indirect taxes over the next fiscal year. Combined with stagnant wages, food inflation at 18%, and utilities rising above 22% in some regions, the financial pressure became unbearable. What began as fiscal policy became a political crisis. Citizen frustration shifted from everyday complaints to direct accusations. The state takes everything, the people get nothing. These sentiments resurfaced across protests in Vladivostok, Novosibirsk, and Irkutsk. Even Kremlin-friendly pollsters saw a drop of 7 to 10 points in regional approval ratings for central authorities, a significant decline within Russia's tightly managed polling environment. Social fabric under pressure. While the economy strained, another rupture spread beneath the surface. A moral and social collapse emerging from the war economy. The war widow compensation scandal, exposed widely across independent Russian channels, intensified public resentment. Criminal networks arranging fake marriages, influencers encouraging young women to marry soldiers for payouts, and families battling over compensation all painted a bleak picture of a society drifting into transactional survival. The compensation amounts were staggering, up to $200,000 in some regions, a life-changing sum for many, equivalent to nearly 2 decades of average income. This created perverse incentives that government officials struggled to address. Western reporters from BBC and Al Jazeera documented dozens of disputes, fraud cases, and leaked testimonies. One regional human rights advocate told the defense correspondent, "People are turning pain into profit. It's no longer about service or sacrifice, it's about survival." The moral implications were profound. As one poll in an underground Telegram channel suggested, more than 60% of respondents believed the compensation system was excessively abused, while 40% feared criminal networks had infiltrated military recruitment channels. Military strain and institutional fatigue. The Russian military, already stretched across multiple fronts, felt the impact of domestic unrest almost immediately. BBC defense analysts noted that the Kremlin had quietly increased mobilization quotas in 3 Far Eastern regions earlier that month, indicating manpower shortages. Yet as protests grew, regional officials became hesitant to enforce new recruitment orders, fearing that aggressive mobilization could trigger further unrest. Additionally, leaked reports from municipal councils indicated rising friction between police forces and military recruiters. Local law enforcement, already facing public backlash, resisted attempts to use them as mobilization enforcers. Videos of officers refusing to detain protesters further eroded the perception of a unified state apparatus. Meanwhile, the mother's viral testimony about her son's abuse by returning servicemen struck a deeper psychological blow. Not only did it show violence spilling from the front lines into civilian life, it raised questions about discipline, accountability, and the moral cohesion of Russia's armed forces. UN human rights observers, quoted indirectly through Western outlets, expressed concern about the reintegration of combat veterans without adequate mental health oversight. Several experts suggested that as more soldiers returned home, incidents of violence, exploitation, and regional criminality could rise, particularly in areas suffering from economic decline. Political fallout. The Kremlin's political calculus had shifted. What began as a tool to suppress dissent now amplified it. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly called the blackout a digital, self-inflicted wound, noting that major authoritarian governments historically lose influence when their control mechanisms become unpredictable or inconsistent. Inside Russia, the blackout shattered the illusion that the state could maintain normalcy while waging a long-term conflict. Citizens who once tolerated censorship and corruption so long as daily life remained stable now faced a government willing to disrupt the entire digital architecture of society to avoid public criticism. Ordinary Russians began connecting the dots. Tax hikes, price increases, forced labor programs, compensation scandals, internet controls, police hesitation, regional unrest. Each factor formed part of a picture more dangerous than any external threat. a nation strained to its limits, with leadership increasingly disconnected from the lived reality of its population. The strategic consequence was clear. Russia's internal stability, long considered its greatest geopolitical advantage, was cracking. And for the first time in years, analysts across Europe, Asia, and the United States began asking a question that once seemed unthinkable. Could widespread unrest inside Russia reshape the global balance of power? The fallout from Russia's nationwide internet blackout did not stay within its borders. Within hours, analysts in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Ankara were examining the implications. Russia's domestic instability has always been viewed as a global event, the type that can reshape alliances, shift military doctrines, and fracture long-standing geopolitical assumptions. But what unfolded in November 2025 carried a different kind of weight. It exposed a strategic vulnerability Moscow had spent 2 decades trying to hide: the fragility of internal cohesion in the world's largest nuclear-armed state. NATO watches closely. NATO intelligence centers in Brussels reported an unusual pattern of Russian troop redeployments toward major urban regions. These movements weren't aimed at the Ukrainian front, but at the Kremlin's own cities, a clear sign Moscow feared unrest more than external threats. Defense News highlighted satellite imagery showing additional Rosgvardia units repositioned near Moscow and Kazan, something typically reserved for major political anniversaries or terror alerts. For NATO planners, 2 concerns emerged. First, instability in a nuclear state raises unpredictable risks. Western analysts stressed that Russia's command structure remained intact, but internal tension creates layers of uncertainty. Second, the blackout hinted that Moscow lacked confidence in its own digital defenses. If the Kremlin believes shutting down the internet was the only way to block alleged drone navigation, it suggested Russia's air defense systems, once viewed as among the world's most advanced, were overstretched. Several NATO experts drew parallels to earlier conflicts where overextension abroad weakened domestic control at home. One retired US Air Force general argued on CNN that a state fighting a long war while suppressing unrest simultaneously is a state burning fuel from both ends. The United States: strategic calculations under the Trump administration. President Donald Trump, newly returned to office, received hourly briefings. His national security team evaluated 3 key questions. Would unrest limit Russia's ability to sustain operations in Ukraine? Could domestic instability make Moscow more aggressive externally? How should Washington balance pressure with caution? Several US officials, speaking anonymously to major outlets, noted a growing belief that Russia's military logistics were reaching a breaking point. Sanctions had eroded critical supply chains, while protest-driven disruptions threatened to slow regional mobilization and defense manufacturing. Yet Trump's advisors also warned against assuming internal unrest would translate into immediate battlefield collapse. Still, US think tanks began studying whether a weakened Russia might shift its posture in the Arctic, where competition with NATO nations had intensified. The blackout raised a possibility that few had seriously considered. Russia's geopolitical reach might shrink faster than predicted if internal pressure continues to grow. The EU: economic and energy repercussions. In Europe, the blackout triggered concerns about energy flow stability. While the EU has dramatically reduced dependence on Russian oil and gas since 2022, parts of Eastern Europe remain vulnerable to supply irregularities. A destabilized Russia could disrupt export volumes, trigger price spikes, or prompt Moscow to leverage energy infrastructure for political leverage. DW reported that European markets reacted nervously. Although gas reserves were high heading into the winter, traders speculated on the possibility of panic policy from Russia, such as temporary pipeline closures or shipping delays. This set off a brief but noticeable rise in energy futures across Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. China, watching a partner struggle. Beijing, Moscow's most important economic lifeline, monitored events with strategic detachment. China had become Russia's primary buyer of discounted oil, natural gas, and military hardware. But Beijing's leaders prefer partners who are strong, predictable, and stable. A Russia struggling with unrest, tax revolts, and blackout-induced chaos is a liability, not an asset. State-run Chinese analysts began quietly asking whether Russia could remain a reliable long-term partner in Eurasia. If Moscow weakens further, China gains leverage, but also risks inheriting an unstable neighbor with diminishing strategic value. There were also concerns about Russia's ability to sustain its military presence in Central Asia, an area where China has steadily expanded its influence through infrastructure projects and security agreements. A distracted or internally fractured Russia could accelerate Beijing's regional ambitions. Ukraine, strategic advantage through Russian weakness. For Ukraine, the unrest inside Russia provided a rare window of opportunity. With parts of Russia's military infrastructure disrupted by internal tensions, Ukrainian planners reportedly accelerated plans for precision strikes on ammunition depots, fuel hubs, and rail lines near Belgorod, Bryansk, and Rostov. Western outlets observed that Ukrainian forces adapted rapidly, making use of cheaper, expendable drones that cost only a few $1,000s to manufacture, a stark contrast to Russia's reliance on multi-million-dollar air defense systems. CNN noted that a $3,000 drone taking down a $1 million radar installation had become a recurring theme of the conflict. Ukraine's biggest strategic gain, however, was psychological. The blackout proved the Kremlin feared its own people just as much as it feared foreign drones. For Ukrainian morale, this was a seismic shift. Middle East and Global South, shifting alignments. In the Middle East, Russia's internal instability created questions about its commitments in Syria, Iran, and Libya. If Moscow pulls back forces or weapons shipments to focus on domestic security, regional power balances could change rapidly. Analysts from Al Jazeera reported speculation that Iran might attempt to fill any vacuum left by a retreating Russia, while Turkey and Saudi Arabia reassessed their strategic calculus. Meanwhile, countries in the Global South, once receptive to Russian narratives about resisting Western influence, now saw images of Russians protesting over taxes and economic hardship. The Kremlin's claim of strength suddenly looked fragile. Weapon systems, cheap versus expensive. Globally, military planners examined how the unrest intersected with battlefield realities. Russia's reliance on expensive hardware, from S-400 systems to advanced cruise missiles, clashed with Ukraine's adoption of low-cost, mass-produced drones. The economic imbalance was stark. A single-caliber cruise missile cost more than $1 million. A Ukrainian naval drone? Less than $10,000. This asymmetric equation was becoming unsustainable for a Russia drowning in tax hikes and shrinking revenues. Meanwhile, Russia's domestic unrest threatened to slow production at Kaluga, Tatarstan, and Uralvagonzavod, key hubs for engines, armor plating, and artillery. If factories face worker resistance or increased absenteeism due to the blackout and protest climate, weapon output could fall sharply. 3 to 6 month scenarios. Major think tanks outline 3 possible scenarios for early 2026. Scenario 1. Controlled unrest, most likely. The Kremlin restores full internet functionality, makes minor concessions on taxes, and uses targeted security operations to keep protests fragmented. Scenario 2. Expanding unrest, moderate likelihood. Economic pressure deepens, protests grow, key regions experience prolonged service disruptions. Moscow deploys more force, risking international condemnation. Scenario 3. Structural instability, low but rising likelihood. Widespread unrest triggers elite fractures. Regional leaders begin openly criticizing Moscow. The federal government scrambles to maintain cohesion, affecting military operations and alliances. Every Western outlet agreed on one point. Russia had entered its most uncertain phase since the mid-1990s. But this time, the stakes were far higher. Because global power balances, nuclear stability, and the future of the ongoing war all depended on what happened next. By the end of the second day, Russia found itself standing at a crossroads it had not faced in decades. The internet blackout, a desperate attempt to stifle unrest, had backfired, exposing cracks in the nation's political, economic, and social foundations. The state that once prided itself on centralized command and unshakable authority suddenly revealed a more fragile reality. A government fearful of its own citizens, a military overstretched across multiple fronts, and a society exhausted by rising taxes, shrinking wages, and mounting corruption. Footage of protests sweeping from Vladivostok to Novosibirsk shattered the illusion of national unanimity. Leaked documents, circulating across Telegram despite the blackout, showed pre-planned efforts to suppress dissent. Defense companies quietly enforced unpaid hour-of-victory shifts. Criminal groups orchestrated exploitation schemes around soldier compensation. Mothers publicly challenged officials over abuses. Even police hesitated in the face of growing crowds. In global capitals, analysts began recalculating assumptions. NATO increased surveillance. The Trump administration reassessed strategic pathways for Ukraine. China monitored Russian instability with caution. European markets braced for potential energy shocks. Meanwhile, Ukraine accelerated drone strikes and tactical operations, sensing momentum shifting in its favor. Russia's internal instability was no longer a domestic event. It had become a geopolitical shockwave stretching from the Arctic to the Middle East. Yet despite the turbulence, one truth emerged above all. Russia is entering a period of uncertainty not seen since the late 1990s. Its leadership confronts simultaneous crises: economic hardship, social fatigue, military strain, and political distrust, all converging into a moment with no easy exit. This raises urgent questions the world cannot ignore. Will the Kremlin make concessions to calm the public or respond with harsher measures that deepen the crisis? Will the unrest weaken Russia's military operations abroad or push Moscow toward more unpredictable actions? And most critically, could this domestic fracture mark the beginning of a long-term reconfiguration of Russia's role on the global stage? The answers will shape not just Russia's future, but the trajectory of Europe, the United States, and the broader international order. For now, the only certainty is that the world is watching, closely, cautiously, and with growing concern. If you want to follow how this story evolves and how these fractures reshape global power dynamics, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps drive the conversation, and your engagement ensures this story reaches those who need to see it. What do you believe comes next? Could Russia stabilize, or is this only the beginning?